On August 7, 2020, Twitter user Cinematography posted a photo collage rather simply entitled "The Good for Her Cinematic Universe," prompting an uproar amongst Twitter cinema and film buffs that proceeded to immediately take the tweet at face value rather than as the playful, lighthearted joke it was likely meant to be received as. However, regardless of the original intentions, this tweet was the first that provided a formal title to describe a steadily expanding subgenre of film that had been taken note of but had never been formally defined. Yet even 4 years following their original tweet, while the term "good for her" is thrown around frequently and often used to market upcoming horror thriller releases, especially ones featuring a female protagonist, the definition of what constitutes a good for her movie has remained messy at best and undistinguishable at worst, and is frequently and constantly debated. However, after closely examining the movies that cinematography used in this universe and the movies that are most commonly classified as staples of this genre, I believe I can lay out the criteria that defines it. Now, before laying out this criteria, it's worth clarifying what the title "Good for Her" is referencing, as there's a large number that interpret it literally and then find themselves horrified by the movies that are grouped under it. The title "Good for Her" references a moment in Arrested Development where Lucille Bluth is watching the news report on a young mother that, fearing she could take no more, released the emergency brake on her vehicle and allowed it to roll backwards into a nearby lake, with her and her young children presumably being inside. While this is news the majority of people would respond to with horror, Lucille happily chimes, "Good for her," upon hearing it. And for those completely unfamiliar with Arrested Development, despite being her family's head matriarch, Lucille is the furthest thing possible from a nurturing, affectionate mother, and likely applauds this action because she's been tempted to reenact it with her own children on multiple occasions. All of this to say that she's not particularly nice, and that a good for her movie doesn't necessarily mean a movie in which your female protagonist is acting in a morally upright fashion the audience is meant to want to emulate. Although good for hers can certainly feature morally upright protagonists, they're more so movies where a female character is caving into a dark and taboo impulse to levy vengeance against those who they view as having wronged them, or is currently in the process of employing such measures to free themselves from a position of servitude or confinement. The original tweet features 8 movies: The Witch, Midsommar, Us, The Invisible Man, Knives Out, Gone Girl, Ready or Not, and the 2018 Suspiria remake. And while though I don't actually consider all of these movies to be good for her films under my definition, I still naturally sat down and attempted to discern what united these movies, aside from the fact the majority were classified as horrors and thrillers. And the answer lies in where their female protagonists start versus where they ultimately wind up. All of these movies feature protagonists that have been dealt an injustice of some kind, but are able to, by the end of the movie, either levy revenge against the people that wronged them, or ascend to a position of power entirely unlike their initial one. The ideal good for her featuring both. The methods the protagonist employs to achieve these things vary drastically. Mara Carbrara from Knives Out remains, morally speaking, squeaky clean throughout the movie's run, whereas Gone Girl's Amy Dunn levies every tool and resource at her disposal to do harm. But the methods themselves aren't what matters the most here. What matters the most in terms of defining the good for her genre is the feeling of catharsis the audience is supposed to receive at the end. But what exactly makes these movies feel cathartic? The majority of good for her movies feature outlandish female protagonists, the likes of which the overwhelming majority of us have never met anyone remotely close to. Amy Dunn is a rich, privileged New York socialite the majority of us have never met, but we've all met her husband, Nick, a brooding, lazy man that simultaneously resents his partner while draining them of their each and every resource, before proceeding to swap them out the instant they grow the littlest bit boring or inconvenient. If you're a woman, you've either dated Nick Dunn, or you've watched a woman you loved be victimized by Nick Dunn, and are therefore excruciatingly familiar with the type of man Nick Dunn embodies. And for my beloved movie-onlys that think I'm being just a bit too harsh on Mr. Dunn, please know that he's significantly worse in the novel. But that being said, in terms of this story, Amy serves as a vehicle for the anger the audience harbors against this particular type of person. And there is a certain satisfaction in seeing her succeed. This is an essential component of good for her movies as a whole. Outlandish characters you will never realistically encounter levying revenge against characters that are rooted in reality. Characters that resemble the people that have hurt us personally. You're never realistically going to meet Haley from Hard Candy, a precocious, maybe 14-year-old vigilante that kidnaps and torments sex criminals. But unfortunately, you may potentially meet Jeff, a creep that chats up and grooms high school girls. And because these characters themselves are unconventional, so then are their methods of vengeance. Proportionality isn't a concern with the good for her cinematic universe, likely because the types of people the protagonist's vengeance is levied against are people rarely punished in day-to-day life. Looking back at Hard Candy, if Jeff had fulfilled his original intentions, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, he would have likely received 30 months in jail, the average sentence for a statutory rapist, meaning about 2.5 years for raping a 14-year-old girl. But moving beyond the realm of law, because not every person a good for her protagonist levies revenge against has committed a crime that would be formally tried in court, There's no way for the protagonist to measure what exactly would constitute proportional revenge. But even if they could, I can safely guarantee you the majority would not be interested. Now, in terms of the vengeance itself, what should it theoretically look like? I won't lie. It's usually extraordinarily violent, mainly because most forms of media shy away from depicting women committing deliberate acts of violence. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Ideally, the good-for-her protagonist finds a way of beating her opponents at their own game, or utilizes their own worst qualities against them. And this can be done socially, academically, professionally, and so on, although it's most often done violently. As with The Invisible Man, which features the protagonist of the movie using the very contraption her ex-husband has been using to psychologically torment her to end his life. At the end of the day, it's a course of action that simply must reverse the dynamic that we've been presented with at the start of the movie, in which the characters that victimized our protagonist are robbed of the power they once possessed, and our protagonist is the one left holding it all. Now, that doesn't mean that every measure undertaken in a good-for-her film is a justifiable one, but to the audience, there is satisfaction in these immediate extremes, because they so often represent the first moments in which our protagonists can realize their autonomy and typically follow periods of immense repression. Now, when outlining this definition, people typically ask, well then, could any movie in which a female protagonist winds up with power and overthrows the people that oppressed or wronged her be considered a good for her? The people that ask this often bring up movies like Legally Blonde, which star eccentric women that overcome the odds and prove the people that previously doubted or defied them wrong. And while though I love movies like Legally Blonde, I don't consider them to be good-for-her films, largely because they lack that dark underbelly which I believe to be a staple of the genre. That doesn't mean by any means I believe the movie has to be a slasher in order to be considered a good-for-her film, but if we take a look at the title itself, Good for Her, it's a reference to women that, for the most part, have forsaken moral convention or have been thrust into circumstances that force them to temporarily do that. Its origins don't imply cleanliness or moral purity. But to briefly set revenge aside, the most important thing a good-for-her film must bear in mind is how it approaches its female protagonist's anger. And in order to be a true good-for-her film, the protagonist's anger must be treated as legitimate and serious. While some good-for-her films have comedic undertones, the anger in of itself cannot be treated as frivolous and unworthy of attention. As part of what makes these movies fun to watch is that women's anger is notoriously framed as being the butt of a joke, and in the event that it's not, it's framed as either being pathetic or annoying. Good-for-her films provide a welcome reprieve in this regard, consistently approaching female anger in a manner that doesn't just treat it as legitimate, but as something worthy of address and resolution. So at this point, when defining the good-for-her film, we have a film featuring a wronged female protagonist whose anger is addressed seriously and who's allowed to amplify her attempts to garner vengeance to the greatest possible extremes. By the end, while she may not quite necessarily be happy, she'll have secured this in some form, and may possibly have ascended to a unique position of power that contrasts the state of helplessness and duress we first might have found her in. But that being said, there's a few movies that may initially appear to match this criteria that I do not consider to be good-for-her films, but rather the polar opposite, bad-for-her films. So what separates the two? Two of the most popular films that may initially appear to meet the criteria of the good-for-her film but do not qualify as good-for-her films are Midsommar and The Witch, or The Witch. While these films may feel cathartic at first, upon closer inspection, they're shams. The bad-for-her understandably feels similar at first, being defined by extreme acts of what appears to be cosmic judgment befalling those whom have personally harmed or victimized the protagonist. But the key difference lies in the fact that protagonists of bad-for-hers are not the ones that are committing these acts. Neither Midsommar or The Witch features a female protagonist that ultimately grows to realize their autonomy. But they do, however, feature ones that have been robbed of it. The freedom that Danny finds with the cultists and that Thomasin finds with the witches is false, and the power they attain comes at the expense of their personhood and previous identities, and is the little they can cling to in such unfortunate circumstances. Where the good-for-her is cathartic, the bad-for-her is cautionary. In The Witch, Thomasin may have found temporary freedom from her family's extremist tendencies, only to wind up being shackled to a new master whom, given the fact that he is literally the devil, isn't likely intended to be viewed as a kind, benevolent, preferential ally. Danny is the May Queen, but has been completely and utterly psychologically broken after being isolated in a moment of vulnerability. There even being some interpretations that pose the argument that Danny is the character that will naturally be sacrificed next, and so although it may initially feel satisfying to watch Thomasin fly or Danny smile, don't fall into the trap the two do. Now, while the good-for-her film is frequently criticized for the measures that its protagonists employ, it's one that I find oddly refreshing. For decades, it's been extraordinarily common for any fictional woman that defies what social convention believes a woman ought to be or how a woman ought to behave herself to be condemned with death, regardless of how petty the reason. For instance, let's take Zara, the babysitter from Jurassic World. Zara doesn't actually do anything wrong in the movie. She has a slight attitude, but I would as well if my boss tasked me with entertaining her nephews when that wasn't a responsibility I would ordinarily anticipate. And yet, Zara is bestowed the franchise's most drawn-out, torturous death, and has a sequence that's so long it suggests the audience is expected to find either humor or catharsis in it, which feels weird because this is a character that barely even speaks. In an interview with the director Colin Trevorrow, he clarifies his reasoning as to why Zara had the death she did by stating, "We definitely struggled over how much to allow her to earn her death, and ultimately, it wasn't because she was British, it was because she was a bridezilla." She had one line about the bachelor party, "Oh, all his friends are animals." In the end, the earned death in these movies has become a bit standard, and another thing I wanted to subvert. How can we surprise people? Let's have someone die who doesn't deserve to die at all. Now, you may see that the last two lines clarify that Zara's death isn't framed as being a deserved one, and while I don't even think deaths in fiction have to be earned, I am personally a bit jaded and find it difficult to view them as anything other than a last-ditch attempt to avoid the controversies the first half of that statement otherwise would have elicited. But that being said, you get the gist. After decades of female characters receiving this sort of treatment, it's delightful to see them forsake convention entirely, and I'm especially curious to see how this genre will shift and expand in the future. Now, regardless of whether or not you enjoyed the good for her, it's certainly good for me that you swung by, so if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And here's an extra special thank you to our Patreons. What we do would not be possible without your support. If you would like to consider yourself among them, the link is in the description. Thank you so much for your time, and have a fabulous day.